At 72 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. Hurricane seasons in Miami, raising 3 boys as a single mother after my husband died young, building a successful accounting practice from nothing. But nothing prepared me for the day my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye and called me helpless in front of the entire family. She thought I was just another forgotten old woman who'd lost her edge. She had no idea she'd just challenged someone who'd spent 50 years solving other people's problems. And when I discovered her marriage to my son was crumbling because of her own mistakes, I decided to do what I do best: fix what's broken, even if she never asked for my help. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Martinez, and for most of my life I've been the person others turn to when everything falls apart. It started early. I was the middle child in a family of 7, the one who mediated fights between siblings, who figured out how to stretch grocery money when Dad lost his job, who somehow always knew how to make things work when they seemed impossible. When I was 25 and pregnant with my second son, Michael, my husband Roberto died in a construction accident. Suddenly I was alone in Hialeah with 2 babies under 3 and no income. People expected me to crumble, to move back with my parents, to accept whatever help was offered with grateful silence. Instead, I enrolled in night school while working 2 jobs, cleaning offices after midnight and doing bookkeeping for small businesses during the day. By the time Michael started kindergarten, I had my accounting degree and my own small practice. By the time he graduated high school, Martinez and Associates had 15 employees and handled the books for half the local restaurants and auto shops in Miami-Dade County. I didn't build it by being helpless. I built it by seeing problems others couldn't solve and finding ways to solve them. Sawas. Michael grew up watching me work. He'd sit in my office after school, doing homework while I balanced ledgers and negotiated payment plans for struggling clients. He saw me handle angry creditors, confused business owners, and tax situations that would make grown men cry. I think that's why he became an engineer. He learned early that every problem has a solution if you're willing to dig deep enough to find it. When Michael met Jessica at Florida State, I was cautiously optimistic. She was studying communications, came from a well-off family in Tampa, and seemed genuinely interested in making him happy. They dated for 3 years, and during that time, I watched her carefully. Not because I was looking for flaws, but because I wanted to understand who my son was choosing to build a life with. Jessica was charming, there was no denying that. She had a way of lighting up a room, of making conversation flow easily at family gatherings. She was beautiful in that effortless way some young women possess, long blonde hair that never seemed out of place, a laugh that made everyone want to be part of the joke. Michael was clearly smitten, and honestly, I was happy to see him so in love. But I noticed things too. Small things that probably meant nothing individually but created a pattern when you stepped back far enough to see it. Jessica had opinions about everything: restaurants, movies, vacation destinations, even the way I arranged furniture in my living room. She never presented these opinions as demands, just gentle suggestions wrapped in compliments that somehow always ended with her getting her way. "Mrs. Martinez, you have such a lovely home, but have you ever thought about moving that bookshelf? It might open up the space more." Before I knew it, I'd be rearranging my living room, wondering how a simple comment had turned into a furniture repositioning project. She had a gift for making her preferences seem like the obvious choice, the one any reasonable person would make. When they were planning their engagement party, she convinced Michael that a small, intimate gathering would be so much more meaningful than the big family celebration he'd originally wanted. When they were looking at apartments, she gently steered him away from the neighborhood near my house. "It's sweet that you want to be close to your mom, but we need to start building our own life, don't you think?" I told myself these were normal relationship dynamics. Young couples needed to establish their independence, find their own rhythm. Jessica wasn't being manipulative. She was just being a woman who knew what she wanted. And what she wanted seemed to include my son's happiness, so I kept my observations to myself. The wedding was beautiful, held at a historic estate in Coral Gables. Jessica looked stunning in a dress that probably cost more than I'd spent on my car. Michael looked proud and nervous, and completely devoted. I watched them exchange vows and felt that mixture of joy and melancholy that every mother feels when her child takes this particular step into adulthood. During the reception, I found myself seated with Jessica's family and some of her college friends. The conversation flowed around topics I didn't quite connect with: expensive resorts, designer brands, social media influencers I'd never heard of. I contributed when I could, but mostly I listened, trying to understand this world my son was entering. Bekapakinas hapabache hapolaptache, bekapababache hapolaptache, bekapabavamucha, bekapababache hapababache derabache, bepidiza kapalababavababacha. One of Jessica's cousins was talking about her grandmother, who lived in an assisted living facility. "Poor thing is so helpless now," she said, shaking her head sadly. "She can't even manage her own medications anymore. It's heartbreaking how some people just fall apart when they get older." Jessica nodded sympathetically. "It's so important to stay sharp, to keep challenging yourself. I can't imagine anything worse than becoming one of those elderly people who just give up." The conversation moved on, but the word lingered in my mind: helpless. As if aging automatically meant surrendering your competence, your ability to contribute, your right to be taken seriously. For the first 2 years of their marriage, Michael and Jessica seemed happy. They bought a condo in Aventura, both got promotions at their respective jobs, and fell into the rhythm of young professional life in South Florida. They came to family dinners occasionally, usually when Jessica felt like it, and I tried to be the kind of mother-in-law who was supportive without being intrusive. But I started noticing changes in Michael. He seemed tired more often, stressed in a way that went beyond normal work pressure. When I asked him about it, he'd brush off my concerns with vague mentions of adjusting to married life and figuring things out. Jessica would jump in with bright reassurances that everything was wonderful, that they were just busy building their careers and their future together. Texria, I didn't push. I'd learned long ago that some problems reveal themselves in their own time, and forcing the issue rarely helps anyone. But I kept watching, kept listening, kept filing away the small details that didn't quite add up. Jessica had started making comments about Michael's work schedule, his friends, even his hobbies. Nothing harsh or demanding, just gentle observations that somehow always pointed toward the same conclusion: that Michael needed to be different, better, more successful, more sophisticated. "I love that you're so dedicated to your work, honey, but don't you think staying late every night sends the wrong message about work-life balance?" she'd say, then turn to me with a conspiratorial smile. I'm trying to help him understand that advancement isn't just about putting in hours. It's about strategic thinking. Michael would nod and agree, but I could see something dimming behind his eyes. The easy confidence he'd always carried was being replaced by a constant second-guessing, a nervous energy that made him seem like he was perpetually trying to catch up to some standard he couldn't quite reach. I wanted to say something, to ask direct questions, to offer the kind of straightforward advice I'd built my career on. But every time I started to voice my concerns, Jessica would redirect the conversation, or Michael would change the subject, and I'd be left with my observations, and a growing sense that my son was struggling in ways he couldn't or wouldn't articulate. The breaking point came on a humid Saturday afternoon in July, during what was supposed to be a celebration. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was my birthday, my 72nd, and Michael had insisted on hosting a family barbecue at their condo. The whole family would be there: my eldest son Carlos with his wife and 2 teenagers, my youngest son Luis with his boyfriend David, my sister Elena, and a few close family friends. It was meant to be a relaxed afternoon by the pool, the kind of gathering we'd been having for years. I arrived early with a key lime pie I'd made from scratch, using the recipe that had been in our family for 3 generations. Jessica met me at the door wearing a pristine white sundress and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Dorothy, you look lovely," she said, giving me a quick hug. "Oh, you brought pie? How sweet. Though I should mention, we already ordered a cake from that amazing bakery in Brickell. You know, the one that did my friend Ashley's engagement party? I hope you don't mind that we probably won't need the pie. I minded, but I said nothing. I'd spent the morning grating fresh lime zest and whipping the filling by hand the way my mother taught me. It was a labor of love, not a convenience. But Jessica was already moving past the moment, ushering me toward the kitchen. "Michael's setting up the grill," she continued. "Though honestly, I'm a little worried. He's been so scattered lately. Yesterday he forgot to pick up the ice, and this morning he couldn't find the barbecue tools. I swear, sometimes I feel like I'm managing a child instead of a husband." She laughed as she said it. The kind of light, dismissive laugh that was supposed to signal that she was just being playful. But there was an edge underneath it, a sharpness that made my chest tighten. I found Michael on the balcony, struggling with a propane tank that clearly wasn't connecting properly to the grill. His face was flushed with frustration and heat, and when he looked up and saw me, I caught something I'd never seen in my son's eyes before: shame. "Hey, Mom," he said, forcing a smile, "just having a little technical difficulty here." "Here, let me see," I said, moving toward the grill. I'd been lighting propane grills since before he was born, back when we used to camp in the Everglades during summer breaks. "Oh no, that's okay," Jessica's voice came from behind me. "Michael can handle it, he just needs to focus." She moved to his side, placing a hand on his arm. "Honey, remember what we talked about? Sometimes you just need to slow down and think through the steps." Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He adjusted the connection again, checked the valve, tried the ignition. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. "Here," I said again, reaching for the tank. "The connection looks loose. If you just—" "Mom." Michael's voice was sharper than I'd ever heard it directed at me. I said I can handle it. But Jessica was already shaking her head, that same patient smile on her face. "You know what? Maybe we should just order pizza. This whole grilling thing might be too complicated for today." The words hung in the air like humidity before a storm. Too complicated. As if my successful engineer son couldn't figure out a basic barbecue grill. As if the man who designed water filtration systems for entire municipalities was defeated by a propane connection. "It's not complicated," I said quietly. "The fitting just needs to be tightened." "Oh, Dorothy." Jessica turned to me with that bright, condescending smile I was beginning to recognize. "I know you mean well, but this is really more of a man's job, don't you think? And honestly, at your age, you probably shouldn't be messing around with gas connections. That could be dangerous." The other family members were starting to arrive. I could hear Carlos's voice in the living room, the sound of his teenagers racing toward the pool. But I couldn't move from where I stood, Jessica's words echoing in my head. "At your age. Besides," Jessica continued, her voice gaining confidence as she realized she had an audience, "we all know how helpless people can get when they're older. The last thing we need is someone getting hurt because they're trying to do something they can't handle anymore." There it was. Helpless. The word that had been lurking in the background of every interaction, every gentle suggestion, every time she'd redirected a conversation away from my opinions or experiences. She'd finally said it out loud. The silence that followed felt endless. Michael was staring at the grill, his face red now for reasons that had nothing to do with the heat. Carlos had appeared in the doorway and was taking in the scene with growing understanding. Even Luis, who'd just arrived with David, seemed to sense the tension crackling through the air. I looked at my son, my accomplished, intelligent, capable son, and saw him shrinking, not physically, but something deeper. Some essential part of him was contracting under the weight of her words, her expectations, her constant subtle corrections. And he wasn't defending himself. He wasn't defending me. "You're right," I said finally, my voice steady and clear. "Some people do become helpless as they age." Jessica smiled, mistaking my agreement for surrender. "But I'm not one of them." I moved past her, turned the propane valve to the off position, disconnected the tank, checked the rubber gasket that had slipped out of alignment, reconnected everything properly, and turned the gas back on. The grill lit immediately with a satisfying whoosh of blue flame. "There," I said, adjusting the temperature controls. "Ready for burgers." The silence was different now. Jessica's smile had frozen in place, uncertain and slightly brittle. Michael was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Part gratitude, part embarrassment, part something else that might have been relief. "Well," Carlos said from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral, "looks like Grandma still has it." Luis laughed, the tension breaking slightly. "She's been fixing things since before we were born, Jess. Mom could probably rebuild that grill from scratch if she needed to." But Jessica wasn't laughing. She was looking at me with a new expression, one I recognized from my years in business. It was the look of someone who'd just realized they'd miscalculated, who'd pushed too hard and revealed more of their hand than they'd intended. "Of course," she said quickly. "I didn't mean. I was just concerned about safety. You know how I worry." But the damage was done. Not just to me, but to something larger. The careful balance she'd been maintaining, the gentle guidance, the loving concern, the helpful suggestions, had tipped over into something uglier, something that looked suspiciously like control. The rest of the party proceeded with forced normalcy. We grilled burgers and hot dogs, the kids splashed in the pool, and everyone sang happy birthday over the expensive bakery cake. My homemade pie sat untouched on the kitchen counter, a sweet reminder of things that were no longer valued. But I watched. I watched the way Jessica monitored every conversation Michael joined, redirecting him when he started talking about work projects she deemed boring. I watched her interrupt him when he began telling a story about our old neighborhood, steering the conversation toward topics she found more suitable. I watched her roll her eyes when Carlos asked Michael for advice about his teenager's college applications, as if my son's opinion wasn't worth seeking. Most importantly, I watched Michael. I saw him check Jessica's expression before responding to questions. I saw him edit himself in real time, choosing safer topics, blander opinions. I saw him apologize for things that didn't require apologies, spilling a drop of ketchup, laughing too loudly at Carlos's joke, asking for a second beer. This wasn't marriage. This was erosion. When the party wound down and people began to leave, Jessica made a show of being helpful, clearing plates and organizing leftovers. But I noticed she'd conveniently forgotten about my pie until I mentioned taking it home. "Oh, right. The pie," she said with exaggerated enthusiasm. "You should definitely take that. I'm sure it's delicious, but we're trying to eat healthier these days. Too much sugar, you know." As I was preparing to leave, Michael walked me to my car. For a moment, I thought he might say something about what had happened, might acknowledge the tension that had hung over the afternoon like storm clouds. Instead, he helped me load the pie into my passenger seat and gave me a quick hug. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said. "I know Jessica really appreciates having you here." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be strong and independent, and felt something crack inside my chest. Not heartbreak, exactly. Something harder and more productive. "Michael," I said carefully, "are you happy?" He glanced back toward the condo, where Jessica was visible through the glass doors, wiping down the already clean kitchen counters. "Of course I'm happy," he said quickly. "Why wouldn't I be happy?" But he couldn't meet my eyes when he said it. That night, I sat in my kitchen, eating key lime pie straight from the dish, letting the tart sweetness fill my mouth, while I thought about helplessness. About the difference between growing older and growing smaller. About the subtle ways people could be diminished, one small correction at a time. I thought about my son, who'd once built elaborate Lego cities, and explained to me in detail how each building's foundation would support the weight of the structures above. Who'd taken apart our broken toaster when he was 12, and put it back together again, better than new. That boy hadn't been helpless. That man shouldn't be either. I finished the pie and made a decision. If Jessica thought I was too old and too helpless to matter, she was about to learn exactly how wrong she could be. The Monday after my birthday, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick. Not to any employer, since I'd been retired for 5 years, but to my weekly volunteer shift at the Miami-Dade Public Library. I told them I needed a personal day, which wasn't entirely a lie. What I needed was time to think, and more importantly, time to investigate. You don't run a successful accounting practice for 30 years without developing certain skills. Reading between the lines, following paper trails, recognizing patterns that others miss. Most importantly, understanding that the numbers always tell a story. You just have to know how to read them. I started with what I could observe directly. Over the next 2 weeks, I made it my business to pay closer attention to Michael and Jessica's life together, not by being intrusive or obvious, but by being the kind of concerned mother-in-law who drops by occasionally with home-cooked meals and offers to help with small tasks. The first thing I noticed was their financial situation. Jessica had always been a spender: expensive clothes, frequent salon appointments, elaborate date nights at trendy restaurants. During their engagement and early marriage, this had seemed like normal young professional indulgence. But now I was looking at it through different eyes. When I stopped by their condo on a Wednesday evening with a casserole, I noticed the stack of mail on their kitchen counter. Not intentionally snooping, just the natural observation of someone who'd spent decades helping clients organize their financial lives. Credit card statements, several of them. A notice from their HOA about late fees. An overdue bill from what looked like a furniture store. "Everything okay with your finances?" I asked Michael casually as we waited for Jessica to get home from what she'd called an important networking event. He laughed, but it sounded forced. "Yeah, everything's fine. Jessica just likes to live well, you know? She says we need to invest in our image if we want to advance in our careers." I nodded, filing away the phrase, "invest in our image." In my experience, people who couldn't afford their lifestyle often used euphemisms like that to justify overspending. "How's your job going?" I asked. "Still enjoying the environmental engineering work?" For the first time in months, Michael's face lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "Actually, yeah. We just got approval for this amazing water reclamation project in Homestead. It's exactly the kind of work I've always wanted to do. Real environmental impact, innovative technology. The whole team is excited about it." "That sounds wonderful." "You must be proud." "I am," he said. Then his expression dimmed slightly. "Jessica thinks I should be focusing more on management track positions, though. She says being hands-on with projects doesn't show leadership potential." There it was again. Jessica's voice in his head, redirecting his natural enthusiasm toward her version of success. When Jessica arrived home 40 minutes later, she was carrying shopping bags from Nordstrom and complaining about traffic. She greeted me politely, but with obvious impatience, as if my presence was disrupting some important schedule. "How was your networking event?" Michael asked. "Productive," she said curtly, then launched into a detailed explanation of why they needed to attend more upscale events, join better clubs, be seen in the right places with the right people. According to Jessica, Michael's career was stalling because he wasn't making the right connections. I listened to this lecture, because that's what it was, and watched my son's face. He nodded at appropriate intervals, made agreeing sounds, but his eyes had gone flat. This was clearly a conversation they'd had many times before. Left shies. After I left that evening, I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving home. Something about the whole interaction felt wrong, but I needed to understand exactly what I was seeing. The next weekend, Luis invited Michael to go fishing, something they'd done together since childhood. Michael seemed excited about the plan until Jessica found out about it. "This Saturday?" she said, checking her phone calendar. "But we have that housewarming party for my sorority sister. I already RSVP'd for both of us." "I didn't know about any party," Michael said carefully. "I mentioned it last week. You probably weren't listening." Her tone was light, teasing, but there was steel underneath it. "Besides, this is exactly what I mean about priorities. Networking with successful young professionals versus sitting on a boat with no purpose." Luis was standing right there, having stopped by to confirm the fishing plans. The insult landed like a slap, but Jessica seemed completely unaware that she'd just dismissed Luis's company as worthless. "Right," Michael said after a pause. "Of course. The party is more important." Luis left shortly after, and I could see the hurt in his eyes. This was his brother, his fishing buddy since they were kids, choosing a stranger's housewarming over their family tradition. But what bothered me more was the way Michael had accepted Jessica's dismissal without question, as if his own desires and commitments were automatically less important than hers. I started paying attention to their social media, something I'd never done before. Jessica's Instagram was a carefully curated collection of restaurant photos, outfit pictures, and couple shots that looked more like a lifestyle magazine than real life. Michael appeared in many of the photos, but always as a supporting character in Jessica's narrative. More telling were the captions. Convincing my husband to try new things. Over a photo of them at some expensive sushi place. Finally got Michael to upgrade his wardrobe. With a picture of shopping bags from stores I knew he'd never choose himself. Teaching my engineer husband about wine. At what looked like a pretentious tasting event. Every caption positioned her as the teacher, and him as the student. Every post suggested that Michael needed improvement, guidance, correction. It was death by 1,000 tiny cuts, each one individually seeming harmless, but collectively creating a picture of a man who apparently couldn't be trusted to make his own choices. The breakthrough came when I was having lunch with my sister Elena at our usual Cuban place in Little Havana. Elena, who'd worked as a marriage counselor before retiring, had always been good at reading people. "You're worried about Michael," she said without preamble, cutting into her ropa vieja. "Is it that obvious?" "To me, yes. What's going on?" I told her about the birthday party, about Jessica's pattern of corrections and redirections, about Michael's growing silence and compliance. Elena listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding in recognition. "Classic emotional control," she said when I finished. "Death by 1,000 paper cuts. The victim doesn't even realize what's happening because each individual incident seems so small, so reasonable. But why would she do that? She chose to marry him." Elena sighed. "Some people need to feel superior in their relationships. They're attracted to good, decent partners precisely because those partners won't fight back when they're being diminished. It makes them feel powerful. So what do I do? Michael won't admit there's a problem." "Of course he won't. He's probably convinced himself that she's just trying to help him become better. That's how this kind of manipulation works. It disguises itself as love." That conversation gave me the framework I needed to understand what I was witnessing. This wasn't about Jessica being difficult or demanding. This was about systematic erosion of Michael's confidence and autonomy. Over the following weeks, I documented everything. Not in a creepy, obsessive way, but with the methodical attention to detail that had made me successful in business. I kept notes on my phone about conversations, about Michael's body language, about the patterns of interaction I observed. No kiss. The picture that emerged was disturbing. Jessica had isolated Michael from most of his old friends, redirected his career ambitions toward goals that served her image rather than his passions, and established herself as the final authority on everything from what he wore to how he spent his free time. But the most damaging thing was how she'd convinced him that all of this was normal, even beneficial, that her constant corrections were signs of caring, that her control was actually support. Iskalud. I realized that simply talking to Michael wouldn't work. He was too deep in the fog of manipulation to see clearly. And confronting Jessica directly would only give her ammunition to paint me as an interfering mother-in-law who couldn't accept her son's marriage. I needed a different approach. Something that would force both of them to confront the reality of their relationship without me being the obvious catalyst. That's when I remembered something from my early days running the accounting firm. Sometimes, when clients were making destructive financial decisions, but wouldn't listen to direct advice, I had to find ways to help them see the consequences of their choices more clearly. Not by lecturing them, but by arranging circumstances that would make the truth impossible to ignore. Jessica thought I was helpless, irrelevant, too old to understand modern relationships. She was about to discover that underestimating Dorothy Martinez was a very expensive mistake. I began making phone calls, reaching out to old contacts, gathering information. Not about Jessica's personal life, but about her professional one. About the image she was so concerned with protecting. About the career she claimed required all these expensive lifestyle choices. Because if there was one thing I'd learned in my 72 years, it was this. People who are that focused on appearances usually have something important they're trying to hide. The first crack in Jessica's carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source, my hairdresser. I'd been going to Rosa's salon in Coral Gables for 15 years, ever since I'd helped her husband navigate a particularly complicated tax situation with the IRS. Rosa had a gift for remembering details about her clients' lives. And, more importantly, she heard everything that happened in Miami's interconnected professional circles. "Mrs. Martinez," Rosa said as she sectioned my hair for highlights, "didn't you tell me your daughter-in-law works at that big PR firm downtown? Morrison and Associates?" "Yes, she's in their communications department." "Why?" Rosa lowered her voice, glancing around the salon even though we were speaking in Spanish. "My client, Mrs. Herrera, the one whose husband owns the restaurant chain? She was telling me they fired their whole PR team last month. Something about billing irregularities." I kept my expression neutral, but my mind was racing. "Morrison and Associates?" "Sigh, that's the one." Apparently, they were charging clients for services that were never performed. Fancy dinners, expensive events, all kinds of things that looked legitimate on paper but weren't actually business expenses. I filed this information away carefully. It could be office gossip, completely unrelated to Jessica. But in my experience, when money irregularities surfaced at a company, they rarely involved just one person. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since my business days. I conducted a background investigation. Not anything illegal or invasive, just the kind of public records research that any business owner learns to do when vetting potential partners. Jessica's LinkedIn profile painted a picture of steady career advancement, communications coordinator to senior communications manager to her current role as director of client relations. Impressive titles with corresponding salary expectations. But when I cross-referenced her employment dates with the company's publicly available information, some things didn't add up. According to Morrison & Associates' website, the client relations director position had been created only 8 months ago. Before that, the company's organizational chart showed no such role. It was the kind of job title that sounded important, but might not actually come with the authority or salary that Jessica claimed. I dug deeper, using skills I'd developed when researching potential business clients. Morrison & Associates had been struggling financially for over 2 years. They'd lost several major accounts, downsized their office space, and according to industry publications, were facing serious competition from larger firms with better digital capabilities. This was not the thriving, prestigious company Jessica had described to our family. This was a firm in decline, the kind that might create impressive-sounding titles to retain employees they couldn't afford to properly compensate. But the real revelation came when I started researching Jessica's educational background. She'd always claimed to have graduated from Florida State with a degree in communications and a minor in business. The degree was real. I found her name in the university's graduation records. But when I looked closer at her academic history, I discovered something interesting. Jessica had taken 6 years to complete a 4-year degree, with significant gaps in her enrollment. More importantly, her business minor was in hospitality management, not the strategic business focus she'd implied. It was a perfectly respectable education, but not the elite academic pedigree she'd led everyone to believe. These weren't lies, exactly. They were careful embellishments, the kind of resume enhancement that stops just short of fraud but creates an impression far removed from reality. Jessica had built her entire professional identity on managing perceptions, on making things appear more impressive than they actually were. The pattern extended to her personal life as well. Those expensive restaurant dinners she posted on social media, many of them were during restaurant week, when high-end establishments offered significantly discounted prix-fixe menus. The designer clothes? I started recognizing them as pieces from outlet stores and discount websites, styled to look more expensive than they were. Even their condo, which I'd assumed they owned, turned out to be a rental in a building that offered short-term luxury leases to young professionals who wanted prestigious addresses but couldn't qualify for mortgages. Jessica wasn't just controlling Michael's life, she was financing it with money they didn't have, using credit and manipulation to maintain an image that was fundamentally unsustainable. But the most damaging discovery came when I decided to research Morrison & Associates' recent legal troubles. Public court records revealed that the company was facing a lawsuit from a former client who claimed they'd been billed for services that were never provided. The lawsuit specifically mentioned unauthorized personal expenses charged to client accounts. The case was ongoing, but the depositions were public record. I spent an afternoon at the courthouse, reading through testimony that painted a picture of systematic billing fraud. Account managers routinely charged personal expenses to client budgets, then created fictional documentation to justify the charges. The scheme required someone with access to client files and billing systems, someone trusted enough to handle communications between the firm and its clients, someone whose job involved managing relationships and expectations, someone exactly like Jessica. I sat in my car outside the courthouse, staring at the copies of legal documents I'd printed, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Jessica's expensive lifestyle wasn't funded by a successful career. It was subsidized by what appeared to be systematic theft from her employer's clients. No wonder she was so focused on image and networking. She wasn't building a legitimate professional reputation. She was maintaining the facade necessary to continue her scheme. The pressure she put on Michael to advance his career, to earn more money, to present a more successful image, it wasn't about their joint future. It was about her need for backup financing when her house of cards inevitably collapsed. But there was something else. Something that made my chest tighten with anger. Jessica wasn't just stealing from her employer, she was stealing from Michael's future. Every dollar she spent maintaining her fake lifestyle was a dollar they couldn't save for a house, for children, for the kind of life my son actually wanted. She was sabotaging their marriage from the inside, creating financial pressure that would eventually destroy everything they'd built together. And she was doing it while simultaneously convincing Michael that he was the problem, that his lack of ambition and sophistication was holding them back. That night, I called Elena and asked her to meet me for coffee the next morning. I needed to talk through what I'd discovered with someone who understood both family dynamics and professional ethics. "She's running a long con," Elena said after I'd shared my findings. "Not just on her employer, but on Michael. She's using him as both a cover story and a backup plan." "What do you mean?" "Think about it. A married woman with a stable, professional husband looks more trustworthy to clients and employers. Michael's legitimacy enhances her credibility. And if her scheme falls apart, she needs someone financially stable to support her while she figures out her next move. So all the pressure she puts on him to advance his career is about ensuring he can support her when she can't support herself. She's not trying to build him up. She's trying to secure her safety net." Elena leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. "The cruelest part is that she's convinced him he's lucky to have her, that he needs her guidance to become successful, when the truth is, she needs his stability to survive." I drove home that morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. Jessica hadn't just called me helpless. She'd been systematically convincing my son that he was helpless too, that without her constant direction and improvement, he'd never amount to anything. But I had something Jessica didn't know about: evidence. Documentation. A paper trail that connected her expensive lifestyle to questionable business practices and potential criminal activity. The question now wasn't whether Jessica was damaging Michael's life, it was how to expose the truth in a way that would force him to see reality without destroying him in the process. Jessica thought she was smarter than everyone around her. She thought her ability to manipulate perceptions made her untouchable. She thought calling me helpless would make me retreat into silence and irrelevance. She was about to learn that some of us don't get helpless with age. We get dangerous. I spent 3 days crafting my approach. Not out of indecision, but because I understood that what I was about to do would permanently alter the trajectory of my son's life. There would be no taking it back, no claiming it was a misunderstanding. Once I acted, the carefully constructed world Jessica had built around my family would begin to crumble. The key was timing and precision. A direct confrontation would allow Jessica to spin the narrative, to paint me as a jealous mother-in-law making wild accusations. But if I could create circumstances where the truth revealed itself naturally, where Michael discovered Jessica's deceptions through his own investigation rather than my accusations, then he might actually listen. I started by making a phone call to my former business partner, Carmen Ruiz. Carmen had sold her share of our accounting firm 5 years ago to start a forensic accounting consultancy, specializing in white-collar crime investigations. If anyone could help me understand the legal implications of what I'd discovered, it was her. "Dorothy," Carmen said when I reached her, "I was just thinking about you. How's retirement treating you?" "Not as peacefully as I'd hoped," I said. "Carmen, I need some professional advice. Hypothetically, if someone discovered evidence of potential embezzlement at a Miami PR firm, what would be the proper way to report it?" There was a pause. Carmen had always been sharp, and she'd known me long enough to recognize when I was operating in problem-solving mode. Hypothetically, she said carefully, the evidence would need to be turned over to the proper authorities. The Florida Department of Financial Services handles professional misconduct, and if federal wire fraud is involved, it becomes an FBI matter. And what about the timeline? How long would such an investigation take? Months, usually. Maybe longer if the scheme is sophisticated. Why do you ask, Dorothy? This wouldn't have anything to do with your family, would it? I told her about Jessica, about Michael, about everything I'd discovered. Carmen listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. This is serious, Dorothy. If what you found is accurate, your daughter-in-law could be looking at federal charges. But you need to be very careful about how you proceed. One wrong move and you could compromise any future investigation. I'm not trying to destroy her, I said. I'm trying to save my son. I understand. But sometimes those goals are the same thing. Carmen agreed to review the documents I'd collected, but she also gave me a warning. If Jessica was indeed involved in systematic fraud, she was likely to become increasingly desperate as the scheme unraveled. Desperate people made dangerous decisions. Ikahol, the next phase of my plan required perfect execution. I needed Michael to discover Jessica's financial deceptions on his own, in a way that would force him to confront reality without giving Jessica the chance to manipulate his response. I started with their credit situation. During one of my regular check-in visits, I brought up the topic of financial planning, something that would be natural for a former accountant to discuss with her adult children. Have you and Jessica thought about buying a house? I asked Michael as we sat on their balcony, watching the sunset over Biscayne Bay. This condo is lovely, but rental prices in Miami are only going up. Michael's expression grew uncomfortable. We've talked about it. Jessica thinks we should wait until we're in a better position. A better position financially? Well, yes, and professionally. She wants to make sure we can afford something in the right neighborhood. I nodded thoughtfully. That's smart. Have you checked your credit scores lately? That's usually the first step in the home buying process. Michael shrugged. Jessica handles most of our financial planning. She's better with that stuff than I am. There it was again. Jessica positioning herself as the financial expert while keeping Michael in the dark about their actual situation. I'd be willing to bet that Michael had no idea how much debt they'd accumulated or what their credit scores actually looked like. You know, I said casually, when I was running the business, I always advised my clients to check their credit reports regularly. Identity theft is so common now, and sometimes people don't realize they have problems until they try to make a major purchase. I could see the wheels turning in Michael's head. You think I should check mine? I think everyone should know where they stand financially. It's your credit history, after all. You should be aware of what's on it. That conversation planted the seed. Over the next week, I watered it carefully. I mentioned an article I'd read about couples who discovered credit problems only when they tried to buy their first home. I shared a story about a client who'd found unauthorized accounts on his credit report. I made sure Michael understood that financial awareness was a basic adult responsibility, not an invasion of Jessica's privacy. Meanwhile, I was working on the professional side of the equation. I reached out to someone I knew in Miami's legal community, David Fernandez, a lawyer who'd done work for my business years ago and now specialized in white-collar criminal defense. David, I said when he returned my call, I need to understand something about professional ethics. If someone knew about potential fraud at a company, what would be their obligation to report it? That depends on their relationship to the company and the nature of the evidence, David said. Are we talking about a whistleblower situation? I explained the situation carefully, focusing on the legal and ethical aspects rather than the family drama. David listened with the professional attention of someone who'd handled these cases before. Dorothy, if what you're describing is accurate, this isn't just an employment issue. This could be criminal fraud. The people who were overcharged, they're victims of theft. They have a right to know what happened to their money. And if the person involved was related to someone I care about? David's voice softened. I understand the position you're in. But think about it this way. If this scheme continues, the eventual consequences for your family member will be much worse than if it's discovered and addressed now. Early cooperation with investigators can make a significant difference in how these cases are prosecuted. That conversation confirmed what I'd already suspected. Jessica's situation was going to collapse eventually, with or without my intervention. The only question was whether Michael would be an unwitting victim caught in the debris or an informed adult who could make decisions to protect himself. I decided to accelerate the timeline. B. The next Sunday, I invited Michael over for dinner, just the two of us. I told him Jessica was welcome, but that I specifically wanted some one-on-one time with my son. She declined, claiming she had work to catch up on, which gave me the opening I needed. "Michael," I said as we finished the arroz con pollo I'd made with his father's recipe, "I want to talk to you about something important." He looked up from his plate, immediately wary. In our family, conversations that started with those words usually involved uncomfortable truths. "I'm worried about you," I continued, "not because of anything you've done, but because I see you changing in ways that concern me." "Mom, if this is about Jessica, it's about you," I said firmly. "It's about the fact that my confident, capable son has started apologizing for opinions he's held his entire life. It's about the fact that you've stopped making plans with your brothers because someone else's schedule takes priority. It's about the fact that you seem to think you need permission to make basic decisions about your own life." Michael's jaw tightened. "That's not fair. Marriage is about compromise." "You're absolutely right," I said. "Marriage is about compromise. Both people compromising, both people having equal voice in decisions, both people respecting each other's autonomy and judgment." I leaned forward, holding his gaze. "Michael, when was the last time Jessica compromised on something important to accommodate what you wanted?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Michael stared at his plate, his fork moving rice around without actually eating it. "She loves me," he said finally. "I'm sure she does. But love isn't enough if it comes with conditions that require you to become someone you're not." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "Mijo, I need you to do something for me. I need you to take a hard look at your life, your finances, your goals, your day-to-day happiness, and ask yourself if you're living the life you actually want, or the life someone else has convinced you that you should want." Michael was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the mango tree Roberto had planted when we first bought this house. "What if I don't like what I find?" he asked finally. "Then you'll have information to make better decisions." "But Michael, you can't make good decisions without accurate information. And right now, I'm not sure you have that." When he left that evening, I could see the wheels turning in his head. I'd given him permission to question his assumptions, to investigate his own life. The rest would have to be up to him. But I wasn't leaving everything to chance. The next morning, I made 2 phone calls that would set the final phase of my plan in motion. The first was to Carmen, asking her to formalize her review of Jessica's financial irregularities and prepare a report that could be submitted to the appropriate authorities. The second was to Morrison and Associates, requesting information about their billing practices for a potential business consultation I was considering. Jessica had built her life on the assumption that she was smarter than everyone around her, that her ability to manipulate appearances made her untouchable. She was about to learn that some fights aren't won by being clever, they're won by being thorough. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I was in my garden, deadheading the bougainvillea that had grown wild during Miami's endless summer, when my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, but when I answered, the voice I heard was barely recognizable. "Mom," he said, and the word carried the weight of someone whose world had just shifted on its axis. "Can you come over? I need to talk to someone." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in their living room, watching my son pace back and forth like a caged animal. His hair was disheveled, his work shirt wrinkled, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who'd been staring at uncomfortable truths for too long. "I checked our credit report," he said without preamble. "You were right about needing to know where we stand financially." He stopped pacing and looked at me directly. "Mom, we're buried. I had no idea how buried we are." He handed me his laptop, open to a credit monitoring website. The numbers on the screen made my chest tighten with a familiar dread, the same feeling I'd had years ago when reviewing the books of businesses that were weeks away from bankruptcy. 7 credit cards, all maxed out. A personal loan I was certain Michael had never mentioned. Store credit accounts at high-end retailers that charged premium interest rates. The total debt was staggering, nearly $80,000, not including their monthly rent and car payments. "Michael," I said carefully, "did you know about all of these accounts?" He laughed, but it was a bitter sound without any humor. "That's the thing, Mom. Some of them I knew about. The others—" He ran his hands through his hair. "Jessica said she was managing our finances, that she was building our credit by maintaining multiple accounts. She said it was sophisticated financial strategy. And you believed her?" "Why wouldn't I? She's always been better with money than me, more aware of how these things work. When she said we needed to invest in our image to advance our careers, it made sense. When she said the debt was temporary, just until my next promotion, I trusted her." Michael sat down heavily on the couch, staring at his hands. "But there's more, Mom. After I saw the credit report, I started looking at our bank statements, our monthly expenses. Do you know what we spent on restaurants last month? $4,000. $4,000 on meals that we could have made at home for maybe $300. The pieces of Jessica's financial house of cards were tumbling down, and I could see Michael trying to process the magnitude of the deception. But I knew there was more coming. Revelations that would make the credit card debt seem minor by comparison. "Have you talked to Jessica about this?" "I tried to." When she got home from work yesterday, I showed her the credit report. I asked her to explain how we'd accumulated so much debt without me knowing the full extent of it. Michael's voice grew quiet, distant. "She got angry, Mom, not defensive or apologetic. Angry. She said I was being paranoid and controlling, that I was accusing her of lying. She said if I didn't trust her financial management, maybe I should take over paying the bills myself. And so I did. This morning, I called the credit card companies to get detailed statements. I logged into our bank account and downloaded 6 months of transaction records. I spent the entire day going through everything, line by line." He pulled out a yellow legal pad covered with his handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, annotations in different colored pens. My engineering son had applied his analytical mind to their financial situation, and what he'd discovered had shaken him to his core. "Mom, there are charges on our cards that I don't understand. Expensive dinners at restaurants we've never been to, hotel stays in cities where neither of us has traveled for work, clothing purchases that cost more than I make in a week for clothes I've never seen Jessica wear." I kept my expression neutral, but internally I was connecting dots. Hotel stays and expensive dinners that weren't for their benefit. They were being charged to their personal credit cards to conceal business expenses that Jessica was billing to her clients. "And that's not even the worst part," Michael continued. "Remember how Jessica always said she was working late, attending networking events, building client relationships? I looked at the dates of these mysterious charges, and they correspond exactly to the nights she claimed to be working." The truth was crystallizing in Michael's mind, and I could see it was physically painful for him to process. His wife hadn't just been overspending. She'd been living a completely separate financial life, funded by debt that he was legally responsible for, but had no knowledge of or control over. "Michael," I said gently, "what are you going to do with this information?" He was quiet for a long time, staring at the legal pad with its damning columns of numbers. "I don't know," he said finally. "Part of me wants to confront her, to demand explanations. But I'm afraid of what else I might discover." "What do you mean?" Michael looked at me with eyes that seemed to have aged years in a single day. "Mom, if she's been lying about this, what else has she been lying about? If she could rack up $80,000 in debt without telling me, if she could live this whole secret financial life while lecturing me about fiscal responsibility, what else don't I know?" Before I could respond, we heard the sound of a key in the front door. Jessica was home early from work, her heels clicking against the tile as she entered the apartment. "Michael," she called out, "whose car is that in the parking lot? It looks like your mother's." She appeared in the living room doorway, still wearing her professional facade, tailored dress, perfect makeup, expensive handbag. But when she saw Michael's laptop open to the credit report and the legal pad covered with financial calculations, her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice bright but with an undertone of steel. Michael stood up slowly, holding the legal pad like evidence in a court case. "We need to talk, Jessica, about our finances, about the debt I didn't know we had, about charges I can't explain." Jessica's eyes flicked to me, then back to Michael. I could see her mental gears turning, calculating how much he'd discovered and how much damage control she needed to implement. "Of course, honey," she said smoothly. "But maybe we should discuss our private financial matters privately. I'm sure your mother doesn't need to be involved in our personal business." The implication was clear. She wanted me gone so she could work her manipulation magic on Michael without a witness. But Michael surprised both of us. "Actually, I'd like Mom to stay," he said firmly. "She has 40 years of experience managing finances, and right now I need perspective from someone I trust." The word trust hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's carefully controlled expression flickered, just for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something underneath. Not guilt or shame, but calculation. She was already planning her next move, figuring out how to reframe this situation to her advantage. "Michael, sweetheart, I understand you're concerned about our debt level, but you have to understand the bigger picture. Everything I've done has been to build our future together. Sometimes you have to spend money to make money." "Whose money, Jessica?" Michael's voice was steady, but I could hear the anger building underneath. "Because according to these statements, the money you've been spending isn't money we actually have." Jessica moved into the room, setting down her purse with deliberate calm. "We've been through this before. Building a professional image requires investment. The networking events, the business dinners, the appropriate wardrobe, these aren't luxuries, they're career necessities." "Then explain the hotel charges in Orlando last month," Michael said, consulting his legal pad. "The ones that happened on the same night you told me you were working late on the Henderson account." For the first time since she'd walked in, Jessica was silent. The pause stretched too long, became obvious. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. "I had to meet with potential clients. Sometimes business requires travel you don't expect. Travel that you paid for with our personal credit card instead of company expenses?" Another pause. Another crack in the facade. "Jessica," Michael said quietly, "I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. Because right now, I'm looking at financial records that suggest my wife has been living a secret life, and I don't understand why." I watched Jessica's face as she realized that her usual techniques, deflection, gaslighting, emotional manipulation, weren't going to work. Michael had hard data, documented evidence, and most importantly, he was asking direct questions that required concrete answers. For a woman who'd built her life on managing perceptions and controlling narratives, this was uncharted territory, and I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to panic. Jessica's composure cracked like glass under pressure. For 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, she stood in her own living room, staring at the evidence of her deception spread across the coffee table, calculating her options. When she finally spoke, her voice had shed all pretense of sweetness. "You went through my personal accounts without permission," she said, her tone sharp and accusatory. "That's a violation of my privacy, Michael. I can't believe you'd do something so controlling and paranoid." It was a masterful deflection, turning Michael's discovery of her lies into an attack on his character. I'd seen this technique in business negotiations countless times. When caught in wrongdoing, immediately shift focus to the accuser's methods rather than addressing the accusations themselves. But Michael had spent the last 24 hours staring at mathematical proof of betrayal, and numbers don't lie the way people do. "Our accounts, Jessica," he said quietly. "These are our joint accounts, our shared debt, our shared financial responsibility. And controlling?" He picked up one of the credit card statements. "You've been making financial decisions that affect both of our futures without even telling me they existed. Who exactly is being controlling here?" Jessica's eyes darted between Michael and me, and I could see her mental chess game playing out. She needed to regain the upper hand, to reestablish herself as the wronged party in this scenario. "This is exactly why I handle the finances," she said, moving toward Michael with her hands extended in a gesture of wounded patience. "You get overwhelmed by details, sweetheart. You see numbers and panic instead of understanding the bigger strategy." "Then explain the strategy to me," Michael said, not backing away from her approach, but not welcoming it either. "Explain how 8 maxed-out credit cards and a personal loan I never agreed to are part of some bigger financial plan. It's about building credit history, expanding our borrowing capacity. Jessica. Michael's voice cut through her explanation like a blade. Stop. Just stop with the financial jargon and the condescending explanations. I'm an engineer. I understand numbers, debt-to-income ratios, and compound interest. What I don't understand is how my wife could accumulate $80,000 in debt while telling me we were in good financial shape. The mask was finally slipping. Jessica's carefully maintained professional demeanor was giving way to something uglier, the kind of defensive anger that emerges when someone is cornered with evidence they can't explain away. Fine, she said, her voice rising. You want brutal honesty? Here's brutal honesty. Yes, I've been managing our finances aggressively. Yes, I've been making investments in our future that you wouldn't understand or approve of. Because if I left it up to you, we'd be living in some suburban tract house, driving 10-year-old cars, and shopping at Target for the rest of our lives. Michael's face went pale. What's wrong with any of those things? What's wrong? Jessica laughed, but it was a harsh sound without humor. Michael, look around you. Look at this building, this view, this lifestyle. Do you think you earned this with your environmental engineering salary? Do you think we're living in Aventura because of your career trajectory? The cruelty in her words was breathtaking. She was simultaneously admitting that their lifestyle was unsustainable while blaming Michael for not earning enough to sustain it. It was emotional and financial abuse wrapped in a package of superiority. I'm proud of my work, Michael said, his voice steady despite the obvious hurt. I'm proud of the projects I've completed, the environmental impact we've achieved. I thought you were proud of it too. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, Jessica said, her tone shifting back toward manipulation as she realized she'd gone too far. But pride doesn't pay for the kind of life we deserve. Sometimes someone has to make the hard decisions about our future. Our future? I finally spoke, unable to stay silent any longer. Jessica, the decisions you've made aren't building a future. They're destroying one. You've put my son in a position where he's legally responsible for debt he didn't incur, for purchases he didn't make, for a lifestyle he didn't choose. Jessica whirled toward me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw her without any pretense whatsoever. Her face was flushed with anger, her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled, her professional mask completely abandoned. This is exactly what I was afraid of, she said. The minute there's any kind of disagreement in our marriage, you come running to mommy for backup. Do you see what I'm dealing with here, Dorothy? A 32-year-old man who can't handle adult conversations without bringing his mother into the room. It was a calculated insult, designed to shame Michael into dismissing my presence and isolating him for private manipulation. But it was also a massive tactical error, because it revealed exactly how Jessica viewed our family dynamic, not as a partnership with in-laws she respected, but as a competition where she needed to eliminate my influence over my son. Actually, I said calmly, Michael asked me to stay because he wanted a witness to this conversation. Someone who couldn't be gaslighted or manipulated into forgetting what was actually said. That seems like pretty smart thinking to me. Jessica's eyes narrowed. Gaslighted? Are you seriously accusing me of psychological manipulation? I'm stating an observable fact, I replied. For the past hour, you've tried to convince Michael that discovering your financial deceptions was paranoid and controlling. You've attempted to reframe your secret debt accumulation as sophisticated financial strategy. You've blamed him for not earning enough money to support a lifestyle he never agreed to. If that's not manipulation, I don't know what is. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Jessica was staring at me with undisguised hatred. Michael was looking back and forth between us like a man watching his two realities collide, and I was feeling the particular satisfaction that comes from finally saying things that needed to be said. You know what? Jessica said, her voice now openly hostile. I'm done pretending to respect this interference in my marriage. Dorothy, you've never liked me. From day one, you've been looking for reasons to criticize me, to undermine my relationship with Michael. This whole financial inquisition is just another attempt to drive a wedge between us. Jessica, Michael said, his voice warning, But she was beyond caring about consequences now. The careful control she'd maintained for years was unraveling, and all the resentment and manipulation was pouring out unchecked. No, Michael, she needs to hear this. Your mother thinks she can run our lives because she can't accept that you're a grown man with a wife who comes first. She's been poisoning you against me since the day we got engaged, and now she's using financial issues to try to break us up. I felt a strange calm settle over me. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not planning, exactly, but preparing for. The moment when Jessica's true nature would reveal itself so completely that even Michael couldn't ignore it. Jessica, I said quietly, I haven't said a single word about your marriage or your relationship with Michael. I've only discussed the documented financial evidence that he discovered himself. If you're feeling attacked, it's not because of anything I've said. It's because you're being confronted with the consequences of your own choices. My choices? Jessica's voice was rising toward a shout. Everything I've done has been for us, for our future, for building the kind of life that Michael deserves, even if he's too afraid to reach for it himself. Stop. Michael's voice cut through her tirade like a whip crack. Just stop, Jessica. Stop blaming me for your financial decisions. Stop blaming my mother for discovering them. Stop acting like accumulating secret debt was somehow a gift you were giving me. He stood up, moving away from both of us, running his hands through his hair as he paced to the window overlooking the bay. Do you want to know what really hurts? He said, his back still turned to us. It's not even the money, Jessica. It's the lies. It's the way you've been making me feel stupid and unambitious and financially irresponsible while you were spending money we don't have on a life I never asked for. When he turned around, I saw something in my son's face that I hadn't seen in years. Clarity. I don't care about living in Aventura, he continued. I don't care about expensive restaurants or designer clothes or networking events with people who judge others based on their net worth. I care about building something real with someone who respects me enough to tell me the truth about decisions that affect both of our lives. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but Michael held up his hand. I'm not finished, he said. You called my mother interfering, but she's not the one who's been controlling this relationship. She's not the one who's been making major decisions without consulting her partner. She's not the one who's been accumulating debt in someone else's name while lecturing them about financial responsibility. The transformation in Michael was remarkable. The uncertain, apologetic man who'd been seeking permission for his own opinions was being replaced by someone who'd remembered his own worth. So here's what's going to happen, he said, his voice steady and final. You're going to explain every charge on every card, every account I didn't know about, every expense you've hidden from me. All of it. And then we're going to figure out how to dig out of this hole you've put us in. Together, or not at all. Jessica stared at him as if he'd become a stranger, which, in a way, he had. The compliant husband she'd been molding for 3 years had just reasserted his autonomy, and she clearly had no idea how to respond to this version of Michael. But I knew there was more coming. Because while we'd been focused on the financial deceptions, I hadn't yet revealed what I'd discovered about Jessica's professional life. And those revelations would make her credit card debt look like a minor inconvenience. The silence that followed Michael's ultimatum stretched, like a taut wire ready to snap. Jessica stood frozen in the middle of her carefully curated living room, staring at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. The confident, controlling woman who'd entered the apartment an hour ago had been replaced by someone calculating her next move with the desperation of a cornered animal. You want to know about every charge? She said finally, her voice artificially calm. Fine. But some of those expenses were legitimate business costs that will be reimbursed by my company. The hotel stays, the client dinners, those are investments in our future that you're too short-sighted to understand. I felt the moment arrive like the eye of a hurricane, that perfect instant when all the pieces align and you know exactly what needs to happen next. Jessica, I said quietly, I think there's something else Michael needs to know about those business expenses. Both of them turned to look at me, Michael with curiosity, Jessica with something that looked like fear. What do you mean? Michael asked. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder I'd been carrying for weeks. Photocopies of court documents, billing records, and the forensic accounting report that Carmen had prepared at my request. I mean that some of those, quote, business expenses Jessica has been charging to your personal credit cards are the same expenses she's been billing to her clients at Morrison and Associates. The words landed like a physical blow. Michael's face went white, while Jessica's went through a series of expressions: surprise, anger, and finally, cold calculation. "What are you talking about?" Michael said, taking the folder from my hands. "Your wife hasn't just been overspending your money," I explained, watching Jessica's face carefully. "She's been double billing for expenses, charging clients for business dinners and hotel stays, then paying for those same expenses with your personal credit cards and keeping the client payments for herself." Michael's hands were shaking as he opened the folder and began reading. The forensic report was thorough and damning. It detailed a pattern of fraudulent billing that stretched back over 18 months, totaling nearly $200,000 in theft from Morrison and Associates clients. "This is impossible," Jessica said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You can't have access to private billing records. This is all speculation and—" "It's not speculation," I interrupted. "Carmen Ruiz, my former business partner, is a forensic accountant. She specializes in white-collar fraud investigations. When I gave her the financial records Michael discovered, along with some additional research I'd conducted, she was able to trace the pattern of fraudulent billing." Michael was reading through the documents with the focused intensity of an engineer analyzing structural failures. I could see him connecting dots, cross-referencing dates, understanding the scope of what Jessica had been doing. "The Orlando hotel charge," he said suddenly, looking up from the papers. "The one you said was for a client meeting? According to this report, Morrison and Associates was billed for that same hotel stay on behalf of the Henderson account." Jessica's composure finally shattered completely. "You had no right to investigate me like some kind of criminal. This is a violation of my privacy, my professional relationships." "Your professional relationships?" Michael's voice was incredulous. "Jessica, if this report is accurate, you've been stealing from your clients for over a year. You've been using our personal credit cards to finance a scheme that could send you to federal prison." The word prison hung in the air like a death sentence. Jessica's face cycled through emotions: denial, anger, fear, and finally, a kind of desperate bargaining. "It's not that simple," she said, her voice becoming pleading. "Yes, there were some irregularities in my billing practices, but I was planning to reconcile everything once my next promotion came through. It was temporary borrowing, not theft." "Temporary borrowing?" Michael stood up, the forensic report still in his hands. "Jessica, you stole $200,000 from your company's clients. You used my credit, my financial standing, my future, to finance criminal activity. How is any of that temporary?" For the first time since I'd known her, Jessica looked truly helpless. Not the kind of calculated vulnerability she'd used to manipulate situations, but genuine desperation. "Michael, please," she said, moving toward him with tears in her eyes. "I know I made mistakes, but everything I did was for us. I was trying to build the kind of life we deserved, the kind of success that would make you proud of me." "Proud of you?" Michael's voice was hollow with disbelief. "Jessica, I was already proud of you. I was proud of your intelligence, your ambition, your communication skills. I never needed you to steal money to impress me. I needed you to be honest with me." He set the forensic report on the coffee table and looked at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not hurt, but something deeper and more final. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly. "I can't be married to someone who thinks so little of me that she believes I'd only love her if she was rich. I can't build a life with someone who's willing to destroy our future to maintain an image I never asked for." Jessica's tears were flowing freely now, but even in her breakdown, I could see her mind working, searching for some angle that might salvage the situation. "We can fix this," she said frantically. "I'll quit my job, we'll declare bankruptcy, we'll start over somewhere else. Please, Michael, don't let your mother destroy our marriage with her investigations and her accusations." It was her final attempt at manipulation, trying to cast me as the villain in a story where she was the victim of circumstances beyond her control. But Michael was no longer the uncertain man who could be swayed by emotional appeals and false choices. "My mother didn't destroy our marriage, Jessica," he said with quiet finality. "She exposed what was already broken. The lies, the control, the financial deception. None of that started today. It's been happening for years, and I was just too trusting to see it. He turned to look at me, and I saw gratitude in his eyes, but also something else. The painful wisdom that comes from discovering you've been living someone else's version of your life. "Mom," he said, "what happens next? Legally, I mean." I had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but I'd prepared for this moment weeks ago. Carmen has already submitted her report to the Florida Department of Financial Services and the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. Jessica will likely be arrested within the next few days. Jessica let out a sound that was part sob, part wail. "You destroyed my life. You couldn't stand that Michael chose me over you, so you destroyed everything." "I saved his life," I said calmly, "because eventually this scheme would have collapsed on its own. Federal investigators would have found the same evidence Carmen found. Michael would have been questioned as a potential accomplice, his credit destroyed, his career jeopardized. By acting when I did, I made sure he had documentation showing he was an unwitting victim, not a willing participant." The truth of this seemed to penetrate even Jessica's desperation. She looked around the expensive apartment with its rented furniture and artificial luxury, seeming to understand for the first time that none of it had ever been real. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. "You're going to hire a criminal defense attorney," I said. "And you're going to cooperate with the federal investigation. If you're lucky, full cooperation might result in reduced charges." Michael was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the bay that had never really been theirs to enjoy. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but sad. "Jessica, I need you to move out. Tonight. I can't share a home with someone who's been lying to me about everything that matters." She looked at him with desperate hope. "And then? After some time apart, after I handle the legal issues, could we try again?" Michael's answer was gentle but final. "No. This isn't about the money or even the legal problems. It's about the fact that you've spent 3 years convinced that I needed to be improved, managed, and directed. You never loved me, Jessica. You loved the idea of who you thought I could become." 6 months later, I sat in a different living room, Michael's new apartment in Coral Gables, smaller and simpler than the Aventura condo, but filled with the things he'd chosen for himself. Books about environmental engineering, photos from family fishing trips, furniture that was comfortable rather than impressive. The divorce was finalized yesterday, he told me over coffee, and the tres leches cake I'd brought from his favorite Cuban bakery. Jessica pled guilty to wire fraud and agreed to pay full restitution. She'll serve 18 months in federal prison. How do you feel about that? Michael was quiet for a moment, considering. Sad for her mostly. I think she genuinely believed that the person she was trying to turn me into was better than who I actually am. She was so focused on appearances and status that she lost sight of what actually matters. He smiled, and for the first time in years it reached his eyes. "But I'm grateful too. Grateful that you saw what was happening when I couldn't. Grateful that you cared enough to intervene, even when it meant being the bad guy." "I was never the bad guy, mijo," I said. "I was just the person who refused to watch my son disappear." 3 years have passed since that confrontation in the Aventura apartment. Michael is engaged now to Sophia, a marine biologist he met at an environmental conference. She laughs at his engineering jokes, joins our family fishing trips, and brings homemade empanadas to Sunday dinners. Most importantly, she treats him like a partner, not a project. When people ask me how I knew to investigate Jessica, how I had the courage to potentially destroy my son's marriage, I tell them this. Love isn't just about supporting people's choices. Sometimes love means protecting people from choices that will destroy them, even when they can't see the danger themselves. Jessica called me helpless because she mistook my age for irrelevance, my restraint for weakness. She learned too late that some of us don't become helpless as we get older. We become dangerous in ways that younger people can't imagine. We become patient enough to gather evidence, wise enough to recognize patterns, and brave enough to act when action is needed. I didn't fix my daughter-in-law's broken marriage. I exposed the fact that it was never a real marriage to begin with. And in doing so, I gave my son the chance to build something real with someone who sees him clearly and loves what she sees. Fanachama. That's not helpless. That's what happens when you underestimate a woman who spent 72 years learning how to solve problems that matter. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.